This is the story of how two German chemists learned to pull fertilizer and the raw material of high explosive straight out of thin air, and by doing it, dragged the First World War on for years longer than it should have lasted. Everything you eat today, the bread on your table, is touched by what these two men found. And it began with a war over something almost comically dull: dried bird droppings, or guano, shipped across the world from Chile's deserts. Walk with me, because this is one of the strangest hinges history ever turned on. The Atacama Desert of Chile, the driest place on Earth. Years can pass without a drop of rain, and yet, before 1914, this lifeless coast was one of the most valuable pieces of ground on Earth. Layered across it, baked hard under a merciless sun, lay vast beds of nitrate, the mineral salt that farmers needed to feed their crops, and that generals needed to fill their shells. Chile grew rich on it. Whole port towns sprang up on that empty shore to ship it away. Here is the thing your school biology never quite spelled out. Every living plant is hungry for nitrogen, and though the air above your head is nearly 4/5 nitrogen gas, plants cannot touch a single breath of it. It floats there, useless to them, locked in a form no root can drink. To grow more wheat, you had to feed the soil nitrogen it could use, and for that, the whole industrial world leaned on those Chilean deposits and the mountains of seabird droppings on nearby islands. An empire of dinner tables resting on guano. Now, Germany in those years was doing something remarkable, and it terrified its rivals. Its population had exploded, its factories the envy of Europe, and it fed itself on ship after ship of South American nitrate for its fields. But here is the trap waiting in that arrangement. Germany sits in the middle of a continent. Chile is on the far side of the world, and every ounce of it had to travel by sea, across oceans Germany did not, in the end, control. Guarding those oceans was the Royal Navy of Great Britain, the most powerful fleet the world had ever assembled. Within days of the war beginning in 1914, the British did something quiet, unglamorous, and utterly deadly. They threw a blockade around Germany. No grand battle, no famous charge. Just a ring of grey ships and patient patrols choking off the sea lanes, turning back the freighters, cutting the flow of nitrate down to almost nothing. I always tell my students this: the slowest weapon in that war may have been the sharpest. Sit with the corner Germany was now backed into, because it is a brutal piece of arithmetic. That same nitrate made two things. It made fertilizer to grow the nation's food, and it made the explosive to fill the nation's shells. With the sea shut, Germany could not have both: feed the people or arm the army, one or the other. A country of millions was staring down a choice no country should ever have to make, and the clock was already running. Inside the War Ministry, more than a few already believed the war was lost. By most estimates, Germany had barely 6 months of explosives raw material when the war began. 6 months. After that, the guns would fall silent, not from defeat on the field, but from empty magazines. And if they poured what little they had into weapons, the fields would starve, and the people at home would go hungry that winter. I honestly find it hard to imagine sitting in a government office in Berlin doing that sum, and knowing what the answer meant. The door out of that trap had, astonishingly, been opened 4 years earlier by a driven, difficult chemist named Fritz Haber. A slight man with a shaved head and pince-nez, obsessive and ferociously ambitious, was working in a laboratory in Karlsruhe. In 1909, Haber did what many great minds had tried and failed to do for decades. He took ordinary nitrogen gas straight from the air and under crushing pressure and searing heat forced it to combine with hydrogen, creating ammonia, the doorway to synthetic fertilizer and, later, explosive. Here is a fact that ought to be more famous than it is. Haber first proved it on a benchtop machine barely bigger than a kitchen kettle, dripping out a thin trickle of the compound that would help feed billions. It was a marvel, and also completely useless to a nation, because no one on Earth knew how to build that violent little reaction on the colossal scale a country needs. A miracle in a teacup is not the same as a miracle in a factory. That second, harder miracle belonged to a man history remembers too faintly, Carl Bosch, an engineer at the great chemical firm, then known as BASF. And I will be honest with you here, I think Bosch is the true unsung hero of this entire tale, and it is a small injustice that Haber's name always comes first. If you reckon the person who scales an idea deserves as much glory as the person who dreams it up, throw this video a like. And if you think the original spark always matters most, go and make your case in the comments. I will read every word. Bosch's problem was almost unimaginable, turning that teacup marvel into a factory. He had to build vessels that could survive pressures and temperatures that shattered ordinary steel like glass and hold them steady day after day. His early reaction chambers burst apart under the strain. He tried again and again. Over several relentless years, Bosch and his team tested thousands of metal recipes to find linings that would not crumble, and rebuilt the very insides of the machinery to keep the whole ferocious process from tearing itself apart. When the blockade slammed shut a year later, this was the escape hatch waiting in the wall. By 1913, on the eve of the war, Bosch had done it. A working plant rose at a place called Oppau, near the Rhine, turning air and pressure into ammonia on an industrial scale for the first time ever. When the blockade slammed shut a year later, this was the escape hatch waiting in the wall. Germany could not buy nitrate from across the sea, so it began, quite literally, to manufacture the stuff out of its own sky. I have stood near that stretch of the Rhine, and it is oddly hard to believe a war was extended from ground so unremarkable. Now think what that actually meant on the battlefield. A blockade that should have strangled Germany within a year or two instead only pinched and squeezed as the chemistry raced to catch up. The nation poured resources into vast new factories, most famously a huge complex at Leuna, built at frantic speed to churn out the ingredients of both bread and bombardment. Historians still debate the figures, but there is little doubt this synthetic supply kept German guns firing long after the natural stockpiles should have run dry. Science bought the war more years, and those years cost an ocean of lives. And that is only the darker half of the story. Here is the part that unsettles me most. The very same discovery that armed one side of a terrible war is also the reason so many of us are alive to hear this story. That reaction, spread across the globe, became the foundation of modern fertilizer. By some careful estimates, roughly half the nitrogen in your own body right now passed through a factory built on their work. Half of you, in a sense, is made of captured air. I have tried and failed to wrap my head around that. If you manage it, tell me below how you hold two such opposite truths in one thought. Both men later received their field's highest honor, the Nobel Prize. But neither man ever quite stepped out of the shadow those two truths had cast over them. Bosch sank into disillusion and despair as he watched his own country darken. Haber, the man who fed his nation, would end his days cast out by it. The fullest telling is a tale for another evening, and I will not cheapen it by rushing it here. I am glad you came this far into the story with me. If the hidden machinery behind the great events of the past is what keeps you curious, then stay a while. Subscribe here at History Recreated and tell me which forgotten corner of history you would like me to step into next. Remember this, the next time you pass a golden field of wheat, Empires fought and bled for a mineral scraped off distant shores, and in the end, salvation and slaughter both came drifting quietly down out of the very same air.